we see an upregulation of omega-6, downregulation of omega-3. And we have more recently been able to show that a dietary intervention with omega-3 fatty acids was able to prevent a lot of those negative impacts. That paper is coming out in a couple of weeks.
I see.
And so, yeah, so that's really been a focus recently. And that was, of course, a dietary intervention that we gave the pregnant rats while they were being exposed to the THC. And we were able to block a lot of those negative impacts that was protective all the way into early adulthood.
I see. So it sounds like sort of the two stories that have emerged or are emerging are, if you give a pregnant rodent THC, it throws off the omega-3/6 balance. It skews it towards omega-6s. This has long-lasting consequences, negative brain effects, basically, for the offspring down the road. But it sounds like what you're saying is the new story coming out is that if you do that, but then you also maybe supplement with omega-3s, you can mitigate that effect?
Exactly. Yeah. So that's the paper that's coming out. And yeah, it was a specialized diet that we had prepared, and it was a high omega-3 diet. And basically what we were able to do was prevent a lot of those negative impacts of THC. There's sort of this misperception that cannabis during pregnancy is safer than other drugs that other people that people may use to mitigate some of the negative impacts, some of the negative symptoms of pregnancy. But the research that is emerging is showing that they can have profound effects on those pathways. We don't know exactly why this is happening. That's important to keep in mind because it's such a complicated biosynthetic pathway. We think that there's probably some sort of competition going on.
Yeah.
If you're flooding the brain with these extrinsic cannabinoids, that might be competing with the endocannabinoid system, anandamide and 2-AG, for example. And that's throwing off the normal regulatory pathway and ultimately throwing off skew the balance between omega-6 and omega-3. And importantly, these disturbances were in brain areas that are linked to very serious mental health problems, like the prefrontal cortex, the hippocampus, the striatum. And they're linked to all sorts of risk factors for various problems in later life.
Yeah. One thing I want to ask you, just as kind of a connoisseur of this area myself, is a bit more detail here about something that I've had Margaret McCarthy on the podcast before, and she does really cool work, in my opinion, that has to do with the effects of cannabinoids on development, and part of her world involves the fact that these things often have sex-dependent effects. Did you guys do these studies in male versus female mice, or see anything interesting there?
We did, yeah. I'm glad you asked that. We saw massive sex differences.
Really?
Yeah, it was quite remarkable, actually, and even the brain areas that were impacted were different. So hopefully I'm getting this right, but essentially, we were primarily focused on the prefrontal cortex and the hippocampus, which are obviously very important for disorders like mood anxiety disorders, schizophrenia, cognitive problems, whatnot. And what we found was that the impacts on these fatty acid pathways were different in the males than the females. The males had more profound deficits in the frontal cortex. The females had more profound problems in the hippocampus. And that was reflected in the behavioral symptoms as well. And we don't know exactly why that is, because obviously the developing male and female brain are going to be exposed to different hormone levels and whatnot. We expect it's probably something to do with the fetal milieu. But we also work with our collaborators at the Western University, Dan Hardy's lab, and he's looking at the way we sort of conduct the research is that Dan Hardy's lab looks at the downstream physiological effects, like on the liver and on the placenta. We published a paper a couple years ago where we showed that the prenatal THC exposure disturbs the transfer of fatty acids, the vascularization of an area of the placenta called the labyrinth zone. And the labyrinth zone in the placenta is necessary for sort of that nutrient exchange between the mother and the developing fetus.
Yeah.
So we think it's starting in the placenta. And but ultimately the impacts on males and females is profoundly different. And this persisted all the way into early adulthood. So depending on whether we're talking about a male or female fetus, there's going to be some very different effects. And that has implications also for intervention strategies. because obviously the frontal cortex and the hippocampus are very different. They subserve very different functions in the brain and are associated with different mental health disorders. So that's sort of the next step in the evolution of our research. We're trying to figure out how these intervention strategies, like for example, a dietary intervention strategy, can that differentially impact the male versus female developing brain? It's a really important question.
So you saw big effects from THC exposure in pregnant females on their offspring, whether it was males or females, but the effects were just different in each sex.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Even we were surprised by that. We expected some differences, but nothing that profound. So we were. Yeah.
Okay, so some of these things can be affected by dietary interventions. It sounds like, and we know, I think, that THC is a CB1 receptor agonist, and CB1 receptors are located all over the place, not just in the brain. I believe they do have direct vascular effects, so that would kind of start to make sense of why you would see some kind of placental exchange phenomenon happening.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. I mean, it's a ubiquitous system throughout the entire body. So we sort of, I'm obviously biased towards the brain, but of course, there's a whole sort of peripheral physiology associated with the cannabinoid system as well.
Yeah.